GOAT format is a popular Yu-Gi-Oh format that was originally played in 2005, but that was revived many years later and is enjoyed by thousands of players around the world today. The format takes its name from the lovable spell card Scapegoat. But right now, two of the best GOAT format players of all time are playing for the game's highest stakes ever. It's the 2022 GOAT Format World Championship, and the winner of this match will take home a grand prize of $2,000. Thousands of viewers around the world are sitting on the edge of their seats waiting for the world champion to be crowned.
He's got a Chaos Monster. Yeah. Has to be solemn.
It has to be solemn here. Oh, you can never ring for 19. Okay, I'm tripping. I am tripping. And there is the solemn judgment. He had it.
At the graveyard again. He's got.
He's doing another one. He's doing another
Monster.
one. Do you have another one?
Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning.
Let's
He's gonna Shining Angel here.
Banish that Shining Angel.
Go to the battle phase. Jar Greed is gonna be activated here.
Oh, he yields. And Dingo Sig is going to be your 2022 GOAT Format World Champion. The title will find its way back to France.
But just how did so many Yu-Gi-Oh players fall in love with this old format? Today we're going to answer one big question about GOAT format's history. Why was GOAT format revived in 2012, 7 years after it was originally played? What was the catalyst? Did people just wake up one day and decide to start playing an old Yu-Gi-Oh format? If you want to know the history behind this rich format and why players have been flocking to it like a herd of sheep tokens, then keep watching. Welcome to GOAT Duels, I'm ACP, now let's get to the bottom of this. Every Yu-Gi-Oh player, every gamer even, has the same goal as they sit down to play their next match. This is true whether we're playing with thousands of dollars on the line or if we're just playing with our friends. We all want to have fun. We want to enjoy our matches and feel like the decisions that we make in-game have an effect on the final result of the game. However, for Yu-Gi-Oh players, the game has always had its ups and downs. Sometimes the game feels deep, intricate, and intellectually satisfying. Other times, the game has a mechanic so unfair and so dominant that it seems to get in the way of anyone really enjoying the game at all, at least at the competitive level. From 2007 to 2011, the game seemed to flip-flop between overpowered combos and balanced interactions. So before we even begin to unravel the origin of GOAT format, we first must look at the state of Yu-Gi-Oh! In late 2011. This was actually a time when most competitive players were feeling optimistic about the meta and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole.
As for the plant format, I think it was one of the more skill-intensive metas of that era, and then Order of Chaos came out and kind of messed everything up.
Yeah, I enjoyed that format. The combos were fun, and if you were playing that deck, then you usually had the deck advantage. But yeah, it was a pretty fun deck and a pretty fun format to me.
One thing that I can say that I loved about the format was its deck options. Obviously, Tengu Plans, Dark Worlds, and this one wasn't as good, but especially Heroes. Even though they weren't necessarily at the top, I really liked the fact that my favorite cards can be, somewhat viable. Overall, I really enjoyed the format.
While Plants were the top performing deck and the most popular, Plants also required a good amount of technical skill to play while not feeling too overpowered compared to the top decks of the past. Billy Brake, a well-respected top player, had just won back-to-back tournaments in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series, providing further evidence of just how skillful this plant format really was. But dark clouds were on the horizon as a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Set threatened to break the game wide open. I know that discussing issues like ban list and balance in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is always a contentious subject, but it's really one that cannot be avoided today, as perception about the game's balance at that time is what directly led to the resurgence of interest in GOAT format. So let's talk about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Set Order of Chaos. Order of Chaos was released on January 20th of 2012, and it contained massive support for the wind-up and insector archetypes.
Order of Chaos with Windup and Insectors definitely transformed the game. Those two decks greatly increased the average number of non-interactive scenarios per match, and it made the game a lot more stressful for players, including myself.
I personally hated it. I hated playing against those decks. I especially hated the wind-up loop, but it felt like that was the exact turning point where Yu-Gi-Oh just really started to lose its excitement for me. And that was the moment where new decks entirely lost their appeal. I just lost great interest in the game. The decks were just too powerful at that point.
I absolutely think it was too powerful. It was kind of the beginning of the end for a lot of players in my area, actually. Um, I don't know if I would say it single-handedly overhauled the game, because I felt like the game had kind of been trending in that direction of, here's the new set with all this new really busted stuff that you better buy or you can't compete. But Order of Chaos kind of took that and turned the dial up to 11.
Order of Chaos was very problematic as it enabled windups to discard 3 cards from their opponent's hand on the first turn, and for Insectors to destroy up to 2 cards on the field for free every turn. This created a catch-22 situation for the less powerful decks in the meta. Conserve cards in your hand and get them discarded by windups, but commit them to the field and instead get them destroyed by Insectors. These mechanics felt very unfair to competitive players who preferred the gameplay of decks like Plants, which drew cards and set up strong boards, but still let your opponent play the game and potentially make a comeback. However, this was not the first time that Yu-Gi-Oh! Had seen an overpowered format before, and in the past, Konami had mostly been good about nerfing very overpowered decks soon after they became problematic. For example, in early 2011, Six Samurai became Tier 0 with the release of the set Storm of Ragnarok. But less than a month later, the Samurai deck saw significant hits from the ban list, which still left it as a playable top-tier deck, but not one that oppressively dominated the format. The hope was that the same would happen to the broken cards from Order of Chaos. There was one Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series tournament after Order of Chaos, but before the new ban list on March 1st, and the prevailing view was that Insectors or windups were likely to win, but that everything would be under control shortly after. This turned out not to be the case.
Yes, I was surprised actually that TG's won YCS Atlanta. I honestly thought that Dino Rabbit would for sure take the crown, and I personally definitely thought that TG's lucked out. I didn't think that it needed to be nerfed at all, considering the other more popular decks used at the event.
I think we were all surprised when TG's won, but it's one of those, you go back in hindsight and read the lists that topped the event, and you realize that the combo decks weren't citing a sufficient number of spell trap removal. Today they do, but just back then we didn't know any better. So there was luck and there also wasn't. The part that I think was not lucky was that it just happened to be a great meta call, because nobody was citing the Dust Tornadoes or the third MST, etc. for all those floodgates. So it was a good time for TGs to make their stand, but hitting it was not necessary because it was simply a matter of the player base was just going to learn how to side better afterwards, and that would have taken care of the matchup on its own.
I felt like it kind of found a way to take advantage of a soft spot in the metagame. I always liked to try to explore stun decks and these anti-meta decks back when I was playing, and I had this mentality that the surprise factor could go a long way, and just, getting in there and cutting all of their outs could go a long way. And I think TG just kind of took up the mantle of being the stun deck, and I wouldn't really chalk it up to luck, but I don't think it was OP in need of a nerf or anything. I think Henderson was just really familiar with the deck and what it could do, and he played it at the perfect time for it to be a meta call.
Windups, Insectors, and Rescue Rabbit decks dominated the tournament, taking nearly every top cut slot at the event. However, an anti-meta deck, TGs, actually ended up taking first place. TGs used resilient beast monsters like TG Rush Rhino and Reborn Tengu, alongside Skill Drain and Horn of the Phantom Beast to lock combo decks out of the game and win the battle of attrition. However, the view among competitive players was still that, in spite of this first place finish, TGs were a less powerful sleeper pick that was unlikely to win future tournaments. This view turned out to be 100% correct. However, Konami released their new ban list shortly after the event, and to say that players were not happy would be an understatement. The ban list affected 0 cards in Order of Chaos and left the top 3 decks, Windups, Insectors, and Rescue Rabbits, virtually untouched. However, it contained significant hits to Plants and Agents, the 2 best decks prior to the release of Order of Chaos, but ones that were left virtually unplayable after. This was a massive letdown that set off a chain reaction within the Yu-Gi-Oh community. The question on every player's mind was, why would Konami do this? Why would they leave the best 3 decks untouched while nerfing 2 decks that were bordering on tier 3 at this point?
I do think it was ultimately a mistake to not hit any of those decks. There's really only 2 ways to bring diversity back to the game. You either have to address those decks with the ban and restricted list, or you have to release new cards that are just so OP that you have to play with the new cards and just abandon the old strategies. And I don't know if they maybe looked at Henderson's TG deck and thought that, an outlier just won, so they didn't need to address it, or maybe they had already determined that Dragon Rulers and Spellbooks were going to eventually be running the show, because I'm sure, they're making these sets pretty far ahead. Either way, we just kind of ended up with power creep at that time, and not dealing with those decks on the banned list is probably a big part of that.
Hitting cards that were already overwhelmed by the newer and more powerful stuff that just came out, it just seemed like a total joke. And that's why at that point I decided to strictly play heroes at the time, because again, the top stuff, it wasn't interesting to me, and it was just too powerful. So that's when I really started to think it was Konami's greed, but they were really promoting the new Xyz and the new support that was coming out with these new sets, and I just wasn't a fan of that. So in my opinion, the ban list was a mistake because it shouldn't have been the way that it was. But at the same time, I think it definitely wasn't a mistake because they knew very well what they were doing.
The March list pressured players to purchase more of Konami's newer product, and whether it was a mistake or not depends on whose perspective you're looking from. From Konami's perspective, they got what they wanted out of the list. It's purely a sales push right there.
Soon, players had answers to some of their questions, as Konami proceeded to do something completely unprecedented. They released an article explaining their logic behind every choice in this ban list, if you want to call it logic, that is. However, if you know anything about the internet or public relations, then you know that doubling down on your mistakes and telling your customers that their opinion is wrong tends to not go over too well. But that's exactly what they did, releasing an article series titled Thoughts on the March 2012 Forbidden Limited List. This was a 2-part article series, and I have linked both articles in the series in the description of this video below. I highly encourage you to go check them out and read for yourself. These articles were written by Konami's head of Yu-Gi-Oh! R&D at the time, Kevin Tewart. Interestingly, these articles were posted almost a full 3 months after the ban list was released, which leaves a lot of questions about the timing and motives of these articles. Realize that at this point the new format was now almost halfway over, and players were understandably upset about the state of the game and flaming Konami online over their apparent lack of commitment to game balance. Others, however, did come to Konami's defense, arguing that it wasn't that they were trying to make a meta full of a bunch of overpowered combo decks, but rather that they had made an honest mistake. It's the old argument that one should not attribute to malice what can best be explained by stupidity.
There was pretty much a lot of negative feedback on that. I think a lot of players felt like they were kind of a cop-out. I think it's difficult to sell players on the idea that something like Inzectors were still an up-and-coming deck simply because they didn't have a first-place finish at a YCS at the time of the article. But when they had such a high representation in multiple top cuts, they're not really an up-and-coming deck anymore in my mind. They're already there, right? it's not always about just what's taken first place. It's about the representation, and there was a definite lack of diversity, and they didn't do anything about it, and the articles just kind of felt like an excuse.
So the reasoning in the articles is generally agreeable, with the exception of the wind up and rabbit segments, which I see as Konami just making up excuses. To my earlier point, they want their newest product, to sell, and so they have to make up reasons to not hit their latest products. There is a grain of truth to their point about hitting decks because they aren't doing well yet. But based on my own interactions with Konami, it seems like they tend to add too much weight to win percentage and factor in lopsided interactions less than most players want. So what I mean by that is that if a deck is degenerate but not dominant, Konami tends to look over it a little bit longer than players wish.
Konami themselves proved that it wasn't just incompetence or stupidity, seeing as their ban list articles went on to explain that they were fully aware of the power level of windups and sectors in Rescue Rabbit, but that these decks were all actually good and acceptable for the game. The real problem in their mind was these dirty tuners like Spore, Glow Up Bulb, and TG Striker, which apparently were too good in spite of the fact that now virtually no competitive decks had any use for them. Explaining to the competitive player base why they were all wrong about the meta went over about as well as basically every single other time that a big corporation tried to tell their critics that they didn't know what they were talking about. Of course, by now, PR managers all know that the best response is to either ignore the criticism entirely or issue a fake but sincere sounding apology. But this was 2012, when corporations hadn't yet figured out the optimal strategies for weaseling their way out of a controversy. And needless to say, this article did not garner the response that Konami had hoped it would. The reaction was swift and fierce. Yu-Gi-Oh's top players and creators universally condemned the ban list and the article that attempted to justify it. Even Mega Capital G, known for his consistently awful takes on the game, went on to say that even he was not a fan of Konami's ban list reasoning.
This is probably the most scrutinized ban list that Konami has had in years, at least that I can remember. And he lists some of his reasons, try to have some justification for some of their decisions. Although to me, even still, it looks like a ban list where they had more of an agenda rather than to actually fix the game. Seems like it was more sales driven than anything.
It really just goes to show that it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt.
I stayed in a little bit longer. The Dragon Ruler spellbook format was what finally broke me. I always had a good time playing to a certain degree, but it was never like it was in the older formats. At the time, it was just such a drain financially to keep up with the speed at which the meta was evolving. I mean, I'm not sure why it had to be that way. Like maybe this mentality of, well, the next thing has to be even better, we're not going to sell any packs. Like maybe it was that. It almost created this mentality where the game became about nothing but money. And it started breeding this culture in the community where everybody suddenly acted like they were a game store and they had to make 150% profit off of every card. And it got to the point where trading was almost impossible. It was just this really weird phenomenon. Like I still don't even really understand what happened there.
I continued to play current Yu-Gi-Oh! Shortly after 2012. I played it somewhat till the end of 2013. It just progressively got worse with Dragon Rulers and spell books, and just in general, at that point, I just stopped keeping up with the game.
I did continue to play during this time. I would say that I still enjoy the game because every format has lessons that you can learn from it, but I do recall that being a more stressful time due to the lopsided interactions.
Make no mistake, most of Yu-Gi-Oh's player base pushed on and continued to play the game as it was. The common view was that, hey, it was a shitty ban list, but it wasn't the first one, nor would it be the last. They simply accepted that Konami would not always do what they wanted, but that they could continue to enjoy playing nonetheless. And good for them. Sometimes accepting what you cannot change is what's best for your happiness, but many others could not remain content with the way that the game was evolving.
I feel like pretty much every format from 2007 through 2012, the power creep just got a little worse each time. And by 2011, the jumps from format to format were just so drastic. Like every band list, it was like, this is supposed to be our saving grace to try to bring some balance back to this, and it couldn't even come close to touching it. I mean, it was like every time a new set would come out, there was a new archetype, and there was just no such thing as a staple anymore. Your cards didn't retain any value. It was rough.
A sub-community began to grow consisting of players who became disillusioned with Konami's approach to game design and balance. They felt that Konami's article was just a bad attempt to gaslight them into playing a format that they didn't enjoy. They realized that what they really wanted was to play Yu-Gi-Oh! While not allowing Konami to just make arbitrary decisions that ruined good formats and required players to buy whatever broken cards were in the newest set. They held a more pessimistic view that power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Would only continue to get worse, and that Konami would never really do anything about it like they should. With the benefit of hindsight, this view did turn out to be correct, with each year's new archetypes seemingly more degenerate than the last. From Dragon Rollers to Zodiacs, the Pepe Pendulum deck, and even FTKs with Firewall Dragon and Gem Knights. It's no coincidence that just 2 weeks after Konami's disastrous ban list article, an interesting thread was started on the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Forum, duelistgrounds.com, that began to gain much attention from these disillusioned players.
Duelist Grounds was the go-to source for discussion back in this era. I miss it a lot, actually. I was on there all the time. I interacted with a lot of really cool people on there, really smart people who were very passionate about the game. We were all sort of bound together by that love for the game, and it was a special time.
I was an active member of Duelist Grounds, and initially it was a place where I was able to improve because some of the better players were active there. I do feel pretty strongly about the culture of Duelist Grounds. There was a lot of hive mentality, and so just a lot of just bandwagoning and narcissism. And I'll fully admit that while I was an active member of the community, I became a narcissist myself. And I'm grateful to say that I've shed that identity. It's a place where a lot of people are very wrong, but they're also better than average compared to other communities. So that makes them more sure about their opinion even when they're wrong, and that just is very conducive to narcissism.
Duelist Grounds, the now defunct Yu-Gi-Oh! Forum, known for its brutally honest and over-the-top angry players that apparently don't like anime profile pictures. It's somewhat ironic that the birthplace of GOAT format turned out to be a place that was perhaps as controversial as Konami itself. I could make a whole other video on Duelist Grounds' unique culture. Anyways, where was I? Oh, right. A thread was started on Duelist Grounds titled The Official GOAT Format Thread, April 2005, Forbidden and Limited Lists. The thread went on to become massively popular, receiving thousands of posts and serving as a resource for players that wanted to start playing GOAT format. While every Yu-Gi-Oh! Player has their own favorite format, there weren't very many which attracted broad approval and support from the whole player base. GOAT format was one of those few that many players seemed to be willing to try. And what did they have to lose? Dissatisfaction with the current format was so high that almost anything seemed better in comparison. Many players at this time even made the choice to switch to other games entirely, like Magic the Gathering.
I personally like GOAT format for numerous reasons. For one, it has that retro feel to it and is reminiscent of the cards and the game that I grew up liking. To me, it really feels like a game of its own. I like how games actually last longer, how it's competitive. In my eyes, it's overall balanced. And I also like that it has a fixed ban list. So there's no introduction of new cards that make old ones irrelevant. There's actually surprisingly a lot of diversity in this format. So I just pick one of the many decks I can play and switch them up from time to time.
I like GOAT format because in any given game or match, there are, on average, a lot more opportunities to earn advantage over the opponent through having a greater and deeper set of experience.
Community, obviously, the decks are fun and interactive. There's a nostalgia factor to it that reminds us of simpler times, and even though there's not any new cards being added to the pool, we still see innovation all the time. The meta's evolving, or at the very least cycling. All the theoretical discussions still taking place. The tournament scene's good. It's not hard to find an event to jump into, and they're usually managed pretty well, which adds to the tournament experience. Having a strong community of players and staff to, smoothly run the events and, kind of be in it together. This format literally transcends time and generations of players, and it's something that brings us all together. I feel like we're lucky to be a part of it.
Lots of players liked GOAT format, and everyone had their own personal reasons. Some enjoyed its gameplay, the game's slower pace, the emphasis on card advantage, and the grindy GOAT control mirrors. Others simply had nostalgia for the duel monsters and Yu-Gi-Oh! GX era. I've always said that you can't have Yu-Gi-Oh! Without Yugi. But part of the reason that GOAT Control really appealed to members of Duelist Grounds in particular is that it reminded a dying breed of competitive players what it was like to be on top of the world. GOAT Format's US National Championship in 2005 was won by Max Suffrage, a legendary player from the Duelist Grounds community. In the first wave of GOAT Format's revival that began in 2012, Duelist Grounds' small but vocal community of GOAT format enthusiasts helped spread awareness of the format and grow its base of adherents. A few small tournaments were hosted, and the more that people played the format, the more that they seemed to enjoy it. The format actually turned out to be quite deep, as years later, players are still discovering new tech cards and strategies in their favorite format.
At the beginning of the revival era, there was no official support. It was, just the true diehard fans of the old school game working to kind of reignite that spark. But once the community started to grow, it spread like wildfire, and that part doesn't surprise me because, like I said, the format is awesome, and so is the community.
In terms of player base, I'm not surprised how much GOAT format has grown for all these years, and I hope to see that it continues to grow. In terms of the state of GOAT format, I'm actually surprised because it's just changed a lot, going from just GOAT control mirror matches, and we've seen a lot of just potential and so many different decks and cards. So it's really interesting to see how formats can change over time for sure.
I'm not surprised that GOAT format has exploded in popularity. What I see is that there are four key drivers that have really pushed it into a place of popularity. First is that people who were very well respected proposed the idea in the first place. So you got to have some strong voices backing the community. Second is that it's a quality format. As I mentioned, there's lots of opportunities to get an edge on your opponent. So it has that intellectual reward. And then third, it has an emotional reward as well because a lot of older players have that nostalgia for GOAT format. And then fourth, the infrastructure is fantastic. I mean, you look at how the community is run and the people whose labor goes into making it happen. It's just so well organized, and so whenever you have good systems in place, then people are going to want to participate.
As time marched forward and GOAT format gained momentum, it outgrew its cult-like following on Duelist Grounds and is now a mainstream phenomenon, with online GOAT format tournaments often gaining over 100 entrants. Konami has given in and even recognized the legitimacy of GOAT format themselves with the sanctioning of so-called Time Wizard tournaments, which allow tournament organizers to host their own GOAT format tournaments in real life with Konami's blessing. GOAT format has continued to grow into something bigger and more entertaining than anyone at its beginning could have ever really expected. The last 10 years have shown us all that GOAT format is a wonderful game that rewards technical skill, good deck building, and extensive knowledge of the meta and its counters. Best of all, though, GOAT format allows its community to control its own destiny, rather than be subjugated to the whims of a company that prioritizes profit over customer satisfaction. To summarize, GOAT format's original revival began in 2012, during a format dominated by the degenerate mechanics of windups, insectors, and Rescue Rabbit. After Kevin Tuart wrote an article attempting to justify Konami's ban list choices, this had a blowback effect of only encouraging players to seek out other ways to play Yu-Gi-Oh! At Duelist Grounds, players settled on GOAT format as that alternative, which became greatly cherished. As GOAT format gained popularity, it spread throughout the Yu-Gi-Oh community until it became what it is today. So today I say, thank you, Kevin Tewart, for writing a terrible article about a Yu-Gi-Oh ban list and starting a movement. GOAT format players everywhere owe our gratitude to Mr. Tewart for being the person who truly started GOAT format's revival. That's it, everyone. Thanks for watching. I had to do a lot of research to put this together, but I couldn't have done it without the help of all of these esteemed GOAT format players: SlashTap, Infusions Cap, and Void. If you're just now getting interested in GOAT format and you want to find out what the game is like, then you have to watch this video here about GOAT format's meta. So thanks for watching, and please share this fun GOAT format history lesson with every Yu-Gi-Oh player that you know, so that we can grow the GOAT format community even bigger in years to come.